Chapter 2, Sleuthing on Horseback. After the initial shock of Mrs. Strong's statement, Louise asked, "Did you say the Witch of Lost Lake?" "Yes," the rancher's wife replied. "You mentioned Lost Lake yourself. You've never heard of the witch who lives there?" All the Danas turned toward Mr. Strong as if to inquire, "Is this another one of your wife's superstitious fears?" He must have guessed their thoughts, because he said with a smile, "Martha is not making up the story. Would you like to hear all about Lost Lake?" "Indeed we would," Jean spoke up. "A professor on the train told us there was a mystery connected with it. Before he could go on, the wreck occurred, and we never heard the rest of the story." Mr. Strong, who had been standing up all this time drinking his coffee, now seated himself. "About 40 years ago, there was a large, beautiful lake which the Indians of this region used in some kind of religious ceremonial. When white men moved into the area, they built up a small but thriving community. One day there was an earthquake which caused a great landslide of the mountain bordering the east side of the lake. That's where the town was located. It was almost wiped out, not a soul left alive." "How dreadful," Miss Dana murmured. "You said no one survived," Louise spoke up. "Then how does this witch fit in?" Mr. Strong said that a young woman of the community had been in New York at the time of the disaster. Or rather, she had been in New York and was on her way home. When she arrived, she was confronted with the utter desolation of the catastrophe and, of course, the death of her parents. From the stories I've heard, she was a very lovely young girl, but the shock of the tragedy unnerved her completely. It's rumored she refused to leave the place and became sort of a recluse. People in town say she's a little peculiar, and has been for a good many years. She only comes to town when it's necessary to buy supplies or perhaps get another horse. She never talks to anyone and pays for what she buys with Indian artifacts which she digs up." "Imagine living out there all alone," Jean shuddered. "How can she stand it?" "No one knows," Mrs. Strong put in. "Some people say she has supernatural powers. That's how she got the name of witch. We've never heard her right name. Folks in town always refer to her as the Witch of Lost Lake." Louise and Jean felt that there probably was some other reason why the witch stayed on at the deserted place. Surely her grief alone would not have kept her there. "I wonder what her secret is," Louise thought. Miss Dana asked if the original lake had vanished. "Not entirely," the rancher answered. "One small corner of it has remained. The river into which it flowed disappeared, but a new small stream opened up at the opposite end." "I'd certainly like to meet the witch," said Jean eagerly. Aunt Harriet reminded her nieces that this would be impossible. "We must start back to the train. It is unfortunate having to leave Baron behind, but we can do nothing more." Suddenly Mrs. Strong smiled and said, "If you could possibly postpone going home, John and I would love to have you Danas stay here. Reports are for good weather. You could use some of our horses and make a further search for Baron." "That would be marvelous!" Jean exclaimed. She looked pleadingly toward Aunt Harriet. "Oh, please accept the invitation," she begged. Miss Dana was thoughtful. She did not want to impose on these good-natured people, yet she too had a great desire to retrieve the valuable German Shepherd dog. Mr. Strong spoke up. "I think Martha's idea is an excellent one. When you are ready to leave here, I could drive you to Green River to catch a train for New York." "Aunt Harriet," said Louise, "we could postpone going home for another week or so. School won't open until after Thanksgiving, you know, so we have time." There had been a serious fire at Starhurst School, which the sisters attended, and classes had been suspended since early October. Students had been given assignments for weeks in advance, and the Danas had faithfully studied theirs. "Well, I do appreciate the invitation," Mrs. Dana finally said. "But before accepting, I would like to know more about what we'll be running into if we try to search for Baron." The rancher smiled. "There's no use beating around the bush. This is rugged country with many wild animals prowling about. Incidentally, it is reported that the witch is very handy with a rifle. She's a dead shot hitting wild animals that come to bother her." Louise and Jean closed their eyes for a moment, as if to shut out the sight of the witches mistaking Baron for a wild animal and aiming at him. Louise told herself, "That's all the more reason we should hunt for the dog before it's too late." "If we do stay," Aunt Harriet went on, "we'll have to go back to the train and pick up your luggage. We could walk there, but we couldn't return with all those heavy bags." "I'll soon fix that up," said Mr. Strong. "Are you girls used to horseback riding?" "Oh, yes," they replied. "Then," said the rancher, "you can each ride a horse to the train and take a pack horse with you to carry your luggage." "You're sure it will be perfectly safe for the girls to go alone?" Miss Dana asked uneasily. "Oh, yes," he replied cheerily. "You walked here and didn't see anything to bother you." Miss Dana admitted this was true and gave her consent for the girls to make the trip. "But be careful," she cautioned. Mrs. Strong spoke up. "You can't go in those rigs. Come with me and I'll find you some Levi's and boots." The rancher's wife explained that the Strongs had a daughter who was now married and living in Seattle. Her mother had kept all her riding clothes. "They come in mighty handy whenever we have visitors," the ranch woman added, smiling. "You are extremely kind," Louise told her. Mrs. Strong laughed. "I guess that's partly because I love animals so much. It hurts me to think of that beautiful shepherd dog being lost in the mountains. I want to do everything I can to help you find him." After the girls had changed their clothes, they walked to the corral with Mr. Strong. He chose 2 gentle, well-mannered, sure-footed mares for them. Louise's, he said, was named Ginger. She was a copper palomino and very pretty. He brought out Jubilee, a sleek chestnut quarter horse for Jean. The girls mounted, and after they had ridden around the corral several times, until they felt adjusted to the saddles and the horses' gaits, the rancher led out a pack horse and handed the lead rope to Louise. The girls waved and started off. By following Baron's paw marks and their own footprints, they were able to reach the train in a comparatively short time. Louise dismounted, and while Jean held Ginger, she went to find the conductor. Louise explained to him what the Danas intended to do and gave her name and that of the Strongs so they could be notified in case Baron returned to the train. She was amused by the look of utter astonishment that came over the conductor's face. "I call that fast planning," he said at last, laughing. "I think we can pick up some people at Denver to take your compartment. Send your tickets to the railroad company, and it will refund your fares." When Louise rejoined her sister, she found that several passengers had come up to Jean, including Professor Nesbit. The ones who had not known the girls on the train mistook them for local ranch inhabitants. A couple of young men began to tease the Danas and would not believe they had been traveling on the train until Professor Nesbit assured them the sisters were telling the truth. "Well, how about my going back with you?" one red-haired, grinning youth asked. "I could ride on that extra horse." "Sorry," said Jean, returning his grin, "but our baggage is going to ride on that horse." The young man pretended to be crushed. Professor Nesbit and 2 other passengers helped the Danas carry their luggage to the pack horse and strap it on. When everything was ready, the kindly museum curator said goodbye for a second time. "I wish I could accompany you girls and hunt for dinosaur fossils. It would be very exciting, but I have a couple of lectures to give in Denver. Well, best of luck, and I hope you find Baron." "Thank you," said Louise. "I certainly hope we do. Anyway, we'll let you know." Please do. The professor smiled, waving as the Danas moved off. Louise, still guiding the pack horse, was not able to go very fast, but Jubilee, evidently tired of walking slowly, suddenly began to lope. Her young rider did not try to stop the horse. "This is fun," Jean thought. She gave Jubilee her head. Then, suddenly, too late to pull the horse around, she saw a deep hole. Jubilee stepped into it, and Jean flew off the mare's back. End of Chapter 2.